Welcome back to Closing the Loop, episode 7. The cat's out of the bag. It's a boy! Well, I think it's finally time. I've been keeping something to myself for quite a while now, and not because I was trying to create suspense or make some big announcement. Quite the opposite, really. I wanted to keep this part of my journey quiet until I could introduce him to the people who have been walking beside me for so many years. My students, my academy members, my closest supporters, and the people who have trusted me with their horses and their stories long before there was a podcast or even this Brisbane dream. It felt important to me that they met him first quietly and personally before I shared him with the wider horse world. Some moments don't need to be announced the day they happen. They need to be lived first. They need a little bit of space to become a part of your life before they become part of everybody else's. And on my birthday, April 5th, bringing Heikki home was one of those moments. January this year, I committed to this Olympic dream. And I knew that I had to find another horse by June this year, 2026. And when I brought Heikki home, it wasn't about finally finding an Olympic horse. It was more about meeting a young horse and allowing us the time to simply get to know one another without the pressure that inevitably comes when people know what you're building, and especially if you're building towards something as significant as Brisbane 2032. So I wanted Heikki to simply be Heikki for a while before he became the Olympic horse or the Olympic hopeful horse. I wanted to make some mistakes together. I wanted us to discover one another's personalities quietly before we start building a bigger dream. I wanted our relationship to be built a little bit before inviting anybody else into that process. And looking back now, I'm very grateful that I had that time because those early months, they belong to us. They weren't about creating content or documenting every ride, although I have notes. They were about building trust. So, I'd like to introduce him properly. This horse's name is Heikki. He's a gelding, and if life unfolds the way that I'm hoping it will, and certainly will work toward to get, Heikki is going to be building our journey together with me to Brisbane 2032. Now, even saying those words, they bring up a lot of feelings because there was a time when I genuinely couldn't imagine saying them again. I'm building a journey with my horse toward Olympic Games. You see, after Vesper's injury, I didn't simply lose an Olympic campaign. If you've listened to the previous episodes, you know all about that. I lost a version of myself who believed that that dream was still possible. I lost a version of myself that still hoped. I didn't consciously decide to give up the dream or the hope. Certainly not forever, but I just kind of quietly took it and packed it away because I couldn't imagine carrying it anymore. I didn't feel worthy. And looking back now, I don't think that all those years in between Vesper's injury and now were a detour from that dream at all. I think they were preparing me to return to it, but as a very different person, and certainly as a very different horsewoman. One of the things I've realized since bringing Heikki home is that I no longer think about producing horses the way that I used to. 15 years ago, my attention was naturally drawn toward where I wanted to end up. And every lesson, every competition, and every horse that I was training felt connected to that destination, like almost like a direct line. And this time I find myself paying much more attention to the horse that's standing in front of me today. You know, I don't wake up wondering how quickly I can get him to that next level, or, you know, like what's the next thing we need to get done. Yes, there is a big plan, but I wake up in the morning and I'm open to him presenting himself to me on that day. And then we take steps toward my dream, and hopefully one that he will enjoy too. Now, those are two very, very different approaches. And certainly two very different paths. Now, last week we headed to Maggi Field Days to do demonstrations on Linda Pirelli's How to Talk Horse curriculum, and it turned out to be much more than a demonstration. I wanted to give Heikki the opportunity to experience an outing, not jumping cross-country fences or performing advanced dressage movements or anything like that, but quietly working through connection, relaxation, responsiveness, and confidence in a public environment. You know, home is one thing. Home is familiar and it's predictable and it's safe. But if I'm hoping that one day this horse will cope with the atmosphere of major competitions, then those foundations need to hold together when life becomes noisy, unpredictable, and overwhelming. That's something we simply can't recreate at home, no matter how hard we try. And when you take a horse out, you can only expect them to perform at 80% of what they do at home. It's such a change for a prey animal. So Maggi certainly gave us that experience. Every opportunity to find out where those foundations were sitting. There were helicopters and airplanes landing because the Maggi Field Days grounds are next to an airport. Steam engines would suddenly kind of release these enormous bursts, and that felt like explosions. They kind of echoed through the ground, and not just in the air, but you could feel it on the ground. You'd have stock whips cracking unexpectedly throughout the day, and of course there were crowds of people and machinery and loudspeakers and other horses and livestock. It was a huge amount for a young horse to process, and there were certainly moments where Heikki struggled to regulate himself. And I don't think that anyone could reasonably expect a young horse to remain completely unaffected in an environment like that, because he is 4 turning 5. But part of producing young horses is allowing them to experience those moments without expecting perfection from them. What I found myself paying attention to more than anything else, it wasn't when he became kind of worried or dysregulated. The most interesting thing for me was what happened after he got dysregulated. So every time something startled him or his attention drifted into the environment, I could feel him searching kind of for somewhere to settle again. And sometimes the connection between us became a little thinner, as it naturally does with young horses when their nervous system is pulled towards something they perceive as important or threatening. But what gave me an enormous confidence was how quickly he and I were able to rebuild it. I didn't need to argue with him, force his attention back to me, or pretend that nothing was wrong and the environment wasn't challenging, because it was. All we did was we returned to the same conversations we'd been having for months through connection, relaxation, responsiveness, and confidence. And each time he found his way back. And every time it took less time. It was incredible to see him on day 2 of the 2-day event, where all I had to do was just move a little bit and he'd go like, oh yeah, you're there. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And driving home afterwards, I realized what I was the most proud of. And that had nothing to do with the demos. The content, of course, is fantastic. It wasn't even how he coped with the helicopters and the steam engines or the stock webs. Or, people complimenting him, which was nice. And everything certainly didn't go according to plan, so that wasn't it. What stayed with me most was something more private, something more quiet and tender. And that was that in the middle of an environment that I was asking a great deal of him, by the way, our relationship had become somewhere he could land in and regulate himself. So the world around him hadn't changed. It was still loud and unfamiliar and at times really confronting. What had changed was that he had begun to discover that when things felt uncertain, there was safety in reconnecting with me. And that is the power of the How to Talk Horse curriculum that Linda Pirelli wrote. That. The fact that he stayed with me through all of it. As I was driving home on that Sunday, that quietly brought me back to the beginning of kind of this whole podcast journey that I've been on. In the first episodes, I spoke about my horses become safe spaces for broken humans and for me as a child. And how so many of us find healing because horses ask so little of us emotionally, although they can challenge us if we take a deeper dive. But they don't really need explanations from us. They don't judge our pasts. They simply invite us to be present. And as I reflected on Mudgee, I realized that maybe this journey with Heikki is gently turning that kind of relationship around. So my role is no longer just to find safety in my horse and the horse activities. It's not just for me, but that my responsibility is to become a source of safety for him. Not by overprotecting him from the world, not by putting bubble wrap around him, but yes, protecting, being a protector is important. Not by removing every frightening experience, because that's neither possible nor really desirable if you want to continue to advance and grow. But it's my job to become someone he trusts enough to return to when the world gets bigger than he can manage or process on his own. And when I think about Brisbane 2032 now, I don't picture like dressage arenas or cross-country fences nearly as much as I used to, certainly not when I was focusing on London. Increasingly, I'm finding myself thinking about moments like at Mudgee, those moments of coming back to connection, because I suspect this is where Olympic partnerships are really built. Not in the spectacular training sessions or dramatic breakthroughs, which, yes, are important, but in the ordinary moments where the horse quietly discovers that even when helicopters are landing nearby and steam engines are exploding and stock whips are cracking and the world really feels overwhelming, there's still one conversation that makes sense. And if Heikki continues to believe that coming back to our connection is the safest answer he can find, then I think we're building something far more valuable than an Olympic career we're building a partnership. And maybe that's what closing the loop means for me this week. The first time I chased the Olympic dream, horses were my safe space. And this time, I think the journey is asking me to become theirs. And perhaps that is the greatest privilege of all. Thank you for joining me on this episode 7. Look after yourself. Look after your horses, and I'll see you soon.